All right, I'm glad to be joined here by Professor Steven Levitsky. You might have read his last book, How Democracies Die. He is out with a new book with a co-author, Tyranny of the Minority, Why American Democracy Reached a Breaking Point. Professor, some uplifting titles here, but an important reality check, I guess, on the state of our country.
Yeah, we really wanted to, we wanted a more uplifting title for the second book because, in fact, we're not as pessimistic as everybody else, and we're not as pessimistic as you might think we are. We actually think that there is quite a bit of hope for American democracy and that we can actually get to a much better place. But we face a serious crisis.
Yeah, and you've been writing this, in the years coming out of the Trump years, January 6th, obviously. You talk in the book about how America has changed in particular over the last half century. And I'm curious as to, as we mark 240 years or so of the United States, why exactly is democracy breaking now?
Great question. And the last 50 years have been really interesting years because as a society, we have changed dramatically, demographically, culturally, socially. I mean, social and racial hierarchies that had existed for 2 centuries have been seriously assaulted in the last 50 years. So dramatic change in our society, but our institutions have changed not a whit. The United States, people forget this now, particularly people roughly our age. The U.S. has a long history of working to reform itself and make itself more democratic. The Bill of Rights was the first one. The expansion of suffrage in the early 19th century, Reconstruction, the Progressive Era reforms, the Civil Rights reforms. For most of our history, we have worked to change our laws, our rules, sometimes the Constitution to make our system more democratic. And then we kind of stopped doing that work the last 50 years. So even though, on the one hand, we have this dramatic societal change, and on the other hand, institutional freeze, in effect.
What laws or institutions need to be changed? You talk about the opening up of voting rights. Obviously, we began as a country where only white men could vote, and then that gradually
not even that
white landowning.
The Constitution, or the U.S. Constitution, doesn't include the right to vote. We have a right to bear arms. We do not have a right to vote.
No.
We have a right not to be discriminated against on the basis of race or sex, but the Constitution never included the right to vote, which other democracies have. But that's not where it started. I mean, I think what we have is an excessively counter-majoritarian system. It's a system that was set up in the 18th century at a pre-democratic moment when the U.S., when it was founded, was far and away the most democratic system on earth. In Europe, systems were far more counter-majoritarian. But the U.S. was invented at a time when democracy didn't exist, when democracy was feared, when the masses nowhere in the world had the right to vote, and where even the most democratic thinkers among the elites who founded the country really worried a lot about empowering majorities. But over the course of the last 2 centuries, as other democracies reformed themselves, as countries in Europe got rid of unelected or indirectly elected legislatures, got rid of filibuster-like institutions, got rid of indirect elections, as all democracies in Latin America got rid of their electoral colleges, other democracies grew more democratic and grew more majoritarian without abandoning individual rights, without protecting democratic rules in the Constitution, but took steps to ensure that electoral majorities won power and were able to govern. And that leaves the United States today as an outlier in the sense that we are still a country where partisan minorities can systematically thwart and sometimes even govern over majorities. And we think that should not be the case.
Right. The fear 250 years ago was tyranny of the majority. Your book is Tyranny of the Minority. Why is it that we should not fear the tyranny of the majority as our founders laid out?
Well, we should worry. Well, first of all, it's slightly a myth to suggest that our Constitution was designed around to combat a tyranny of the majority. That was certainly a background fear, and John Adams wrote about it. But most of our counter-majoritarian institutions were designed for much more mundane reasons, right? The framers of the Constitution in the hot summer of 1787 were really worried. The Articles of Confederation had failed miserably.
Right. This was the first system that was set up post-independence.
Right. Had not worked. Our first Constitution didn't work. There had been armed uprisings in different parts of the country. There was a great fear that if we didn't get it together and come up with a working system, that the Union would break down, that the newborn republic would fail, that it might succumb to civil war, that it might succumb, that the breakup of the Confederation of the states could invite French or British military intervention. A lot could go wrong. And so our framers, who were pretty experienced politicians, spent a lot of time negotiating, a lot of time improvising, and figuring out second, sometimes third best solutions that would prevent the Union from breaking up. And that was their overarching concern. Don't break up the Union. Give everybody a stake in the new system. And so the Electoral College was a third best option after every other option had been voted down. It was not some kind of blueprint designed to prevent tyranny of the majority. Madison himself preferred a system in which the Congress elected the president. Other people, and Madison was sympathetic to this, argued for direct election of the president. Those things got voted down. Slaveholding states in the South were fearful of direct election of the president. They got voted down. And so the Electoral College was sort of a last attempt at it was, in effect, it was improvisation. The Senate, Madison and Hamilton both strenuously argued against giving states representation based on territory rather than population. They believed that larger, more populous states should have more representatives than the smaller states. Delaware would have absolutely nothing to do with that. New Jersey, neither. And in order to get an agreement, they had to accept a compromise that gave us the Senate. So these things were not designed to combat majority rule. They were designed to keep the Union together. They were compromises, often second best compromises. But to answer your question, we should be concerned with tyranny of the majority. We absolutely should be concerned with tyranny of the majority. There are two things that must always be protected from the whims of temporary majorities. One is this sphere of individual rights, civil liberties, our right to free speech, to free association, to freedom of assembly, to criticize, to publish, also, freedom of who to marry, what to read, what religion to practice, when to practice it. All that realm of individual liberty needs to be protected from majorities. No electoral majority, no legislative majority should be able to touch that. And secondly, the democratic process itself needs to be protected from the whims of the majority. In other words, a parliamentary majority should not be able to change the political rules of the game to weaken the opposition or entrench itself in power. That is what happened in Hungary under Orban. That's what happened in Venezuela under Chavez. That's what was in danger of happening in Israel under Netanyahu. So individual rights must be protected, meaning we need a Bill of Rights. We need an independent judiciary with review power. And a constitution should be pretty hard to change. The barriers to changing the Constitution, it has to be hard to change the Constitution. It was too easy to change the Constitution in Hungary. It's way too easy to change the rules of the game in Israel. And Chavez found plebiscitary ways to change the rules of the game in Venezuela. But no single party should ever be able to single-handedly rewrite the political rules of the game. Those are two things where the majority must be checked. But there are other areas of life where majorities should prevail, given these other minority protections. Regular legislation. Partisan minorities in the legislature should not be able to systematically and permanently block legislation backed by a majority.
Also known as the filibuster.
Well, that filibuster is one mechanism for doing that.
Yeah.
Any kind of super majority rules for regular legislation, I think is problematic. And of course, in elections, those who win the most votes should, under most circumstances, prevail. It should not be the case that the loser of a popular vote for the presidency win the presidency.
So I guess, you could say the mission of a democracy, a stable, healthy democracy, is to ensure there's no tyranny of the majority, but also not unnecessarily give too much power to the minority.
Right. And I think we have, if you look at the empirical record, particularly in the United States, but in other stable democracies, tyranny of the majority hasn't been as great a threat as folks worried in the 18th, 19th century. The United States has had many problems, many deficits of democracy, abuses from time to time. Rarely has it been a problem of majority tyranny. That's not where the threat lies in the United States.
So, you mentioned these founders, and, some people view them as these visionaries, right? These like superhumans. In some cases, when you look at Supreme Court rulings to this day, right? There's a certain group of legal scholars that are originalists, and they say, well, what was the intention of these, superhero founders? Despite the fact that I understand Thomas Jefferson, envisioned a constitutional convention every 20 years, that, he realized that their ideas would be antiquated. What did the founders say? What would they say about where we're at, given that, we've had less than 36 amendments in 240 years?
Well, the founders, like all of us, had very diverse political views, but I cannot imagine. I think they would have laughed at the notion of the sort of the assumptions underlying originalist thinking. George Washington, just a few months after the Constitution was written, wrote a letter to his nephew describing the newly written Constitution as an imperfect document and one that would require that future generations improve upon it. These guys, some of them believe, not everyone agreed with Jefferson that you had to rewrite the Constitution every 17 years. Madison in particular thought it was important that institutions become entrenched. But I don't think any of them were, because they knew, they were smart guys. They were very impressive, experienced, fairly far-sighted individuals. But they knew that what they had written was a product of compromise, negotiation, and improvisation. No country, no major nation on earth had ever selected a leader in a non-monarchic fashion when we invented the Electoral College. They didn't know what they were doing. They knew they didn't know what they were doing. They were grasping. They were improvising, and so none of these guys were under the illusion that what they had designed was somehow, perfect or could not be improved upon. They were smart enough to know that we should constantly be, not necessarily constantly be changing, but constantly be revisiting and thinking about whether our rules of the game are adequate to the challenges at hand.
Yeah, no, at the time in 1789, I think there's 4 million Americans in 13 states. And obviously a certain percentage of them in slavery. You used Norway as an example of democracy that has changed with the times. I learned from your book that they have the second oldest written constitution behind ours in modern times. How has Norway approached democracy and its evolution in a way that we have not?
Well, Norway, it should be said, has some advantages that the United States doesn't have, in the sense that it is a smaller, and at least until recently, much more homogeneous society than the United States. And building and sustaining democracy and reforming the Constitution, all of those things are much easier in a relatively small, homogeneous society than in a big, heterogeneous place like the United States. So maintaining democracy in a place like the United States or India and Brazil is a different level of challenge than Scandinavia. We should be clear about that.
Yeah.
But first of all, the Norwegians were never as attached to the founding document, I think, or to the specific articles of the founding document the way that Americans eventually became detached. But more importantly, the Norwegian Constitution is hard to change, but it's not as hard to change as the United States. So what it takes in Norway now has one body in parliament, it doesn't have two chambers like the U.S. You need to have 2/3 of parliament in 2 consecutive elected parliaments to pass a constitutional reform. That's a pretty high barrier, right? 2/3 of parliament twice. But that, there are scholars who have sort of calculated the difficulty and created an index of difficulty of reforming the Constitution. The Norwegian case is somewhere in the middle. It's sort of moderately difficult to amend. The U.S. Constitution, among democracies, is the world's most difficult.
Remind us
2/3.
Remind us what we need to do to change the Constitution.
2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of U.S. states. So that is, again, it is rightly difficult to change the Constitution. It should be hard to change the Constitution. It probably shouldn't be this hard to change the Constitution. So Norway, with this high but not insurmountable barrier, has managed to amend its Constitution, I think it's more than 300 times in 2 centuries, and has managed to go from being a country that was far, far less democratic than the United States in the 19th century to being considerably more democratic by most standards than the United States today.
Yeah, during the last 240 years, we've amended 27 times. And if you take out the Bill of Rights, since the Bill of Rights, only 17 there. There's some stuff that we take for granted here in America that we actually don't realize how unique it is. That we're the only democracy in the world, you say, with lifetime tenures for Supreme Court judges. We have this hardest constitution in the world to change. And we're the only presidential democracy in the world where a president can be elected despite not winning the popular vote. We saw it in the 19th century, and we've now seen it twice in the past 20 years. In 2000, Al Gore got the most popular votes. In 2016, Hillary Clinton got the most popular votes. You talk about the 1960s effort and into the 70s to kill the Electoral College. Can you lay out exactly how popular it was at the time, how it came about, and why it failed?
Yeah, it's a case of it simply being too difficult, the barriers to reform being too difficult. So in the late 60s, there was a movement to abolish the Electoral College, in part because the U.S. had a couple of near misses. In the 1960 election, Kennedy came very close to losing the popular vote but winning the Electoral College. And in 68, because of George Wallace, we came very close to the election being thrown into the House.
Because Wallace had won a number of states, and neither of the candidates could have gotten 270.
Right. Yeah. And so that could have led to an electoral crisis. And at the time, in the 60s, so there were 2 near misses, which had the establishment worried. But the Electoral College wasn't really noticeably biased toward one party or another. So both parties could look at the Electoral College and say, this is a potential problem, and getting rid of it is not going to hurt our interests. And so that was a prime time for reform. In fact, both political parties supported abolishing the Electoral College. Richard Nixon, president at the time, supported abolishing the Electoral College. The American Bar Association, the AFL-CIO, the American Chamber of Commerce all supported abolishing the Electoral College. Polls showed more than 70% of Americans supported abolishing the Electoral College. It passed overwhelmingly in the House of Representatives. It had a majority in the U.S. Senate, but it did not get the 2/3 of the votes necessary to pass the Senate.
Back then, the filibuster was 66 votes.
Right, but it's not really the filibuster that blocked it. It's the fact that that you need 2/3 of the votes in the Senate.
Got it.
And they simply didn't have it. So at the time, the New York Times editorialized that it was a shame that it failed, and that it probably would take a disastrous situation like the loser of the popular vote winning the presidency for Americans to sort of get over the line and actually abolish it. Now, that happened twice, as you mentioned, in 2000 and 2016, and yet we still have not come around to reforming it.
Is that because in both cases, I mean, how much of a conversation, I don't recall because it's all kind of a blur, kind of post 9/11 with the Supreme Court in 2000 especially, but in both cases, it was a Republican that lost the popular but won the electoral. And so that has now made the Electoral College more partisan?
Right. It's difficult to get the Republicans to agree to abolish the Electoral College because they have an advantage run. Now that could change. The over the course of more than 2 centuries, the bias of the Electoral College has moved in different directions. Sometimes it's benefited Democrats. In the 50s, it seemed to benefit the Democrats a bit. In the 21st century, it has mostly benefited the Republicans. That could change again. I mean, if this is not imminent, but if Texas were to flip blue,
right,
then suddenly
Republicans want to end the Electoral College in that scenario.
Yeah. I mean, so the ideal moment for abolishing the Electoral College is a time like the 60s when it's not clear which side benefits. And unfortunately, we're not there right now.
So, I remember being in, getting a lot of questions in November, December 2020. And, as the story started to come out about what, people around Trump were looking to do and plan around January 6th. And, I guess I was one of these people who took our democracy for granted. I'm like, listen, our institutions will hold up. Like, no one's been able to take apart the system, et cetera. And yet we got pretty close there. You say in your book that even well-designed constitutions are not foolproof. And you lay out 4 ways in which people try to kind of blow through a constitution: exploiting gaps, excessive use of the law, selective enforcement of the law, and then what you call lawfare. Explain how close did we get, and how is it that the opponents of democracy are able to exploit these 4 different elements?
Well, again, this kind of exploitation of the law, I mean, institutions matter a lot, and we spend a lot of time in the book looking at American institutions and proposing ways of reforming institutions. And so it's not that the design of institutions doesn't matter, but even any rule or any set of rules can be exploited, can be interpreted in multiple ways. And many rules, if overused or underused, can be manipulated. So there's no possibility of designing a set of rules that can't be manipulated. You design the best rules you can, and then you try to create a political system in which politicians do the right thing, and politics don't become so polarized and so overheated that politicians are tempted to manipulate. Because if politicians want to manipulate, if they have a strong incentive to exploit the rules, they will probably find a way to do so. You see that throughout history. In the case of the U.S., I mean, you see it in a bunch of ways, but the principal one has been the vulnerabilities in the having to do with the Electoral College and the Electoral Count Act. If we didn't have the Electoral College, we would have a pretty simple system in which we count the votes for the presidency, and she or he who wins the most votes becomes president. Because of the Electoral College, it is a very elaborate process, in many cases with really arcane rules, in which each state sort of has selects its electors, sends them, they vote, that vote gets certified. It is a very elaborate process. And so more rules and more steps and more procedures just creates more opportunities for shenanigans. Now, fortunately, in most of U.S. history, our politicians have had no desire, no incentive to engage in shenanigans to try to steal an election. But what the Trump folks realized, so in 2020, we really had the first case I know of, where one side was looking at all of these procedures and looking for places to exploit. And they found some. They were not particularly prepared. They didn't have a very strong team. They really didn't have. It was a pretty seat of the pants effort, which is why it failed. That and the fact that we had a lot of really good people in the U.S. government that were doing the right thing, and we have an independent judiciary that did the right thing. And so U.S. democracies, it's vulnerable, but it's not easy to break. And so this sort of half-assed clown car show that tried to overturn the election failed because it was pretty pathetic. but they showed that it could be done. Now, the Congress reformed the Electoral Count Act in some important ways last year so that the exact route that the Trump team planned to follow in 2020 couldn't be replicated in 2024. But again, there is no set of rules and procedures that's foolproof. And the more elaborate the rules and procedures, the more opportunities there are for shenanigans. So, we always have to be vigilant in a democracy, but we have to be especially vigilant when a political party or a political candidate is not clearly committed to playing by democratic rules of the game.
So for the most part in this book, you talk overall about our history, our institutions, the need for reform. You do have a chapter called Why the Republican Party Abandoned Democracy. Some Republicans might admit, some Republicans who are disenchanted with the party would admit that. A lot of Republicans might take issue with the call out there. Why the decision to go specifically after Republicans? And is there blame to go around, or is there more blame on one side versus the other as to where we find ourselves in 2023?
If for two-party democracy to work like the United States, both political parties have to be committed to democracy. Fortunately, that's been the case for most of our history. Parties have good and bad people. They do good and bad things. They're more or less corrupt. They have good and bad candidates, but they've been largely over the last century committed to playing by democratic rules of the game. What we do in the book is we lay out three basic principles for a party that is committed to democracy. A party that is committed to democracy must accept the results of elections win or lose. That's sort of the cardinal rule of democracy. A party that's committed to democracy must always and unambiguously reject the use of political violence. And a party that's committed to democracy must break completely with anti-democratic extremist forces, particularly on their own flank, in their own camp. And in our view, obviously, one can challenge this view, but our view is only one of the political parties has violated those basic tenets in recent years, especially since 2020. Not only was Donald Trump the first incumbent president in the history of the United States to not accept defeat and to try to overturn an election, but the vast bulk of the party went along with it. They didn't all parrot his claims, although some did. But the vast majority of them kind of condoned his behavior. Many of them just hid under their desks and remained silent. Strikingly few Republican leaders got up as soon as the election results were announced. I think it was on the weekend, or it was a few days after the
It was
election.
Saturday. Yeah, it was that Saturday morning.
Saturday.
Yeah.
Very, very few Republican leaders got up and said, okay, that's it. Biden won. Congratulations. Look forward to working with you, which is what you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. The Republican Accountability Project, which is a group of never Trumpers, did a survey of all of the Republican members of Congress, House and Senate, and their public statements, and found that 85 or 86% of them raised some doubts about the legitimacy of the election. That's not a way a Democratic Party behaves. Republicans have also been flirting with political violence. The New York Times did a study, found more than 100 ads in the 2022 campaign, I think it was, in which Republicans were firing automatic rifles in their campaigns. The McCloskeys, remember the McCloskeys
in Missouri, the husband-wife, the husband-wife duo,
that came out with their guns to confront peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters. They were given a featured speaking spot in the Republican convention. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is not the leader of the Republican Party, but is now a pretty high-profile Republican, proposed him for Kyle Rittenhouse for a congressional gold medal. I cannot think of another established party, an established democracy, that flirts with political violence in this way. But most importantly, what most worries me about the Republicans is the violation of the third criteria, the failure to break with anti-democratic extremists. So even after January 6th, even after an effort to overturn an election, and even in the hypothetical that Donald Trump is convicted for trying to overturn an election, the Republican Party leadership, almost to a person at this point, has made it clear that they will endorse him for president. This is the behavior of a political party that's not fully committed to democracy. I don't know what else to call it.
It's interesting to watch we'll be watching the various criminal trials over the course of the next year, some more serious than others. Two of them, a federal one and the one in Georgia, both have to do with the 2020 election. And it's interesting as you laid out the various unique rules that exist here in America, especially as compared to other countries where effectively if someone's convicted of a crime or even accused of a crime in some cases, they can't run for higher elected office. And here in the U.S., is it just something the founders didn't consider?
I'm actually not sure what the founders were thinking. The United States, compared to other democratic societies, is very liberal in the classic sense, very libertarian. We tend to want to let the market decide rather than some state agency or state bureaucrats. And that's true of politics too, right? We prefer that voters decide rather than judges or bureaucrats. In Germany, the state has the power to decide that a political party is a threat to democracy, a threat to the Constitution, and to ban it. In Latin America, as you noted, politicians who are convicted or sometimes even charged with crimes can be barred from presidential elections. Jair Bolsonaro, the so-called Trump of the tropics, the former
president of Brazil,
Trump-loving president of Brazil, is banned from. He also lost his reelection bid. He also tried to conspire to overturn the election. He is now banned from running from office for 8 years. Yeah. He's completely out of politics, whereas Donald Trump is a coin flips away from winning the presidency. So yeah, other societies are give much greater power to either judicial or bureaucratic institutions to ban parties or candidates who are deemed a threat to democracy or are deemed criminal. I sort of take a middle. I'm American. I'm somewhat sympathetic to the U.S. approach. I've seen there's a real danger to empowering the government to ban parties and candidates because that can be politicized.
Well, right. And folks on the right now would say that there's a selective prosecution of Donald Trump happening here.
Right. I think the evidence for that is pretty weak.
Yeah.
I think the U.S. process is pretty independent, and we need to fight to keep it that way. So I don't necessarily have a problem with the fact that we don't have a government agency empowered to bar candidates, because I worry, as I've seen over and over again in Latin America, that process can be politicized and those with the power to do so start to ban their rivals. But I think it's important. It's essential in a democracy that that the parties police themselves, that political leaders, that politicians, that political elites, police their own parties, that they refuse to nominate people that are either engaged in criminal activity or are threats to democracy. Republican leaders, at least the ones who were on stage when Trump first came onto the scene, I guess almost a decade ago, the Mitch McConnells, the Kevin McCarthys, the Paul Ryans, all those guys. There's been a lot of turnover in the Republican Party in the last decade. But the guys who were on stage a decade ago, they knew Donald Trump was a threat to democracy. They knew you talked to them in private.
They thought they could manage him. They thought they could reform him. They thought they could help him see the light.
Or they just didn't want to pay the political price of throwing him overboard. Mm-hmm. And that therein lies the problem. Ideally, if democracy were working well, the Republicans themselves, rather than some state agency or some court, would have rid us of Donald Trump.
I thought it was notable in 2022, you had Democrats sort of playing with fire by supporting building up some of these election deniers, and curious, as you've watched this happen, in a very cynical way, how, Democrats are playing into this.
To that. I was strongly opposed to that. There's a big debate. There was a lot of debate in Democratic circles and among social scientists who study democracy. But I think it was so there's a pragmatic argument that the people on the other side of the debate would make that whichever of these Republicans wins is probably going to behave with the majority and behave in a pretty anti-democratic way. So why not maximize the chances of the large D Democrat winning by backing an extremist candidate? But I think the message that you send, first of all, morally, ethically, I think it's deeply questionable. But the message that you send in doing this, that the Democrats send to voters, to their own people, to the country, in cynically supporting people who are potentially extremist threats to democracy, I think is really, really costly. So I was opposed to it.
You lay out a number of important parts of our system that are in need of reform after more than 2 centuries here. One area you dive into is the U.S. Senate. You talk about the power of a Wyoming voter versus a California voter in the Senate. Explain, I think it'd be interesting. Explain the evolution of the Senate and what's wrong with it today and how is it in need of reform? What's a realistic reform for it?
Realistic reform is different from the reform that we need. The Senate, again, the Senate is in many respects the same body that it was in that was created in the 18th century. This was a compromise. It was not the compromise that Madison or Hamilton wanted, but the insistence on by very small states like Delaware that every state get equal representation regardless of population. That won the day.
Right. So this was a counter to the U.S. House, which is more seats for higher population, and the smaller states said in the other body we need more power.
Right. And look, in their defense, democracy wasn't really a thing in 1787 yet. But in the way we think about democracy in the world over the last century, in the 20th, 21st century, is democracy means that politicians represent people. They don't represent land. They don't represent territory. They represent people. And so there's I would say a consensus, not necessarily among Americans, but among people who think about and study democracy, and certainly democracies in other parts of the world, that population should prevail over territory in political representation. So what we have in the U.S. Senate is an antiquated institution, and the problem is that the founders, the Delaware is so terrified of being imposed upon by states like Pennsylvania and New York and Virginia that they built into the Constitution the fact that you can only change the structure of the Senate, not by 2/3 of the House, not by 2/3 of the Senate and 3/4 of the states, but all 50 states have to agree to a reform changing representation in the Senate.
Impossible.
So there's
right?
no chance of that happening, unfortunately. So we're stuck with it. Obviously, the asymmetry between the smallest state and the largest state has grown, I think, 5 or 6-fold since the founding. So it used to be bad. I think a 17-to-1 difference in population per senator between Delaware and I think it was Virginia or Pennsylvania, I can't remember. Now it's something like 80 or 90-to-1 between Wyoming and California.
Right. You have like 2 senators representing South Dakota. You have 2 senators representing California. One state has less than 1 million people. One state has 35 million people, all with an equal amount of power in the Senate.
So that's always been undemocratic. It's always been unfair to states like Texas and California. But what's changed, what's made it more acute in the 21st century is that it's only in the 21st century that our parties are divided along urban-rural lines, where the Democrats are a party of big metropolitan areas and the Republicans are the party of small towns and rural areas. And that's not a perfect statement because Democrats are strong in Vermont, for example. There's some small states, but by and large, red states are states without big cities, and blue states are states with big cities, and they're more populous states. So the structure of the U.S. Senate, through no fault of the Republicans, gives an advantage to the Republicans. Senators are elected for staggered 6-year terms. We elect 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years. So it takes 6 years to fully elect the Senate. In every 6-year cycle since the year 2000, the Democrats have won more votes than Republicans. And yet the Republicans have controlled the Senate for about half that time. That's a problem. So in 2016, the Republicans lost the popular vote for presidency. They lost the popular vote for the Senate, and they came away controlling the presidency and the Senate. That president and that Senate went on to appoint and approve 3 Supreme Court justices, dramatically changing the face of the Supreme Court. If we had simple majority rule, a direct popular election for the Senate and the presidency, we would have a 6-3 liberal Senate. So this is really consequential. That said, as we discussed, very, very, very difficult to change the structure of the Senate. One thing we can do, and this is controversial among Democrats, is eliminate the filibuster. It should not be the case that in my view, that 41, that a small partisan minority, that 41 senators can systematically and permanently block the will of 59 senators. There's something undemocratic about that. That is the essence of minority rule.
No, Democrats are worried about killing the filibuster because it's going to be used against them as well, right? In a Republican majority Senate.
Absolutely. Daniel and I actually had a meeting, a Zoom meeting with all 50 Democratic senators a couple years ago when the Democrats were considering eliminating the filibuster. And that was the pushback that, the Republicans are probably going to win back the Senate in 2024, and we need the filibuster to protect ourselves. And I get it from a partisan standpoint, but from a democratic standpoint, if we want to move our country in a more democratic direction, majority rule has to prevail in the Senate.
Stephen, make the argument to me, let's say I'm a Republican here who's like, this is just some liberal whining about 2016. It convinced me why it's within my interest, given if I'm happy with the results of 2016, as to why what took place in 2016 is a bad thing. I
mean, I think a pretty simple argument could be made that it is never fair for the loser of a presidential election to win the president. The loser of the popular vote in a presidential election should never win. The Electoral College historically has at times benefited Democrats. It's at times benefited Republicans. But I think it's fair. It's not that difficult to step back, all of us, and say, this is not the fairest possible system. And there's a reason why every other presidential democracy on the face of the earth got rid of its electoral college. Many countries in South America, Argentina was the last one to get rid of its electoral college in 1994. People throughout the world, politicians, voters, citizens, believe that he or she who wins the most votes should win an election. So that's a question of basic fairness. Other ones of these rules, for example, the filibuster, I think ending the filibuster does not have clear partisan consequences. There's a very, very good chance that the Republicans win control of the Senate in the next election. There's a decent chance that the Republicans win all 3 branches of government, that win both houses and the presidency in 2024. And there will be a lot of pressure on Mitch McConnell or whoever his successor is.
To kill the filibuster.
To kill the filibuster. I, for one, will be out there agreeing that they should do it. I think most of my Democratic Party friends will be on the other side, but I think that we should do it. So there, I'm in agreement with the Republican who you were embodying. It's good for democracy. One other reform proposal that we make that doesn't necessarily have a clear partisan bias is term limits on the Supreme Court justices. We all agree, I think, that the Supreme Court needs to be independent of the executive. We all believe that justices should serve a much longer period than any presidential period, so that gives justices security. But every other democracy in the world, established democracy in the world, has either a retirement age or term limits, say 12, 18 years. We now are in a position in the United States, whether you're Democrat or Republican, no matter who's in power, each Supreme Court nomination is a crisis. It's like a life or death crisis. And there's a very strong temptation on both sides to manipulate the rules. I personally think that the so-called Merrick Garland seat, the vacancy created by Scalia's death, that seat was effectively stolen by the Republican Party.
Obama had several months left in office and nominated Merrick Garland, and Republicans said, nope, we're giving it to the next guy because it might be Republican.
But no matter what your position on that was a crisis.
Yeah.
And every subsequent appointment to the Supreme Court has been a crisis. If we had regular scheduled term limits, rotation every, say, 18 years on and off the court, and every president, every 4-year term, every president was guaranteed 2 appointments, there would be much less drama to the process. The temperature of the whole process would go down, which I think is something that Democrats and Republicans can agree would be better for us.
Right, but right now it's a 6-3 conservative majority, so less incentive on the right for any reform to the court.
Not necessarily.
Right? No?
Not necessarily. What some progressives seek, and I disagree with this, is court packing to balance out the court.
Right.
So
take it up from 9
court.
justices to 12 or something higher.
Right. I don't think we should do that. I would take what we've got as a given, much as I don't like it, much as I think the Garland seat was stolen. I think we take the court that we've got and we establish term limits going forward. That does not in any way do damage to Republican interests.
So you grandfather in basically the existing 9, and every future justice now abides by this term limit.
I could go either way. I don't think it affects the Republicans heavily, but probably what you just said, grandfathering in the existing justices, probably that's the most palatable way to go. That's a slower reform, but probably yes.
By the way, people don't realize even the Supreme Court size has accordioned up and down through the years a number of times. You write, let's conclude here, institutions won't save democracy. We have to. What gives you hope, Steven, for our democracy? And what is it that the person listening to this podcast can do to help save our democracy?
A lot of things give me hope. I mean, first of all, as we mentioned earlier, U.S. democracy is tough to kill. We have very strong institutions and some really committed, skillful, professionalized people in state agencies, government agencies across the country, running elections, running the Justice Department. And those folks stood up and to a significant extent defended democracy during the Trump period in 2020. And that's a real strength for American democracy. Another thing that gives me hope, I mean, we didn't talk much about this, but my interpretation of why the Republicans radicalized and why U.S. democracy has grown under threat has largely been this country's transition to multiracial democracy. Our long-standing racial hierarchies in this country have been seriously assaulted in the last 50 years, and it's really been felt in the last 20 years. And I think that's a good thing. Not all Americans agree. Right. And there are many, call them MAGA voters, who feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that's radicalizing. But there's no going back on multiracial democracy, right? There's no way either we're going to be a multiracial democracy or we're not going to be a democracy.
Right.
And I think we're going to be a multiracial democracy because younger generations are much, much more willing to embrace the basic pillars of multiracial democracy, which are tolerance for diversity and support for racial equality. Those may sound very simple. Those are 2 simple pillars. It is only in the 21st century that a majority of Americans, looking at polls, are committed to those 2 things. But we are now committed to those 2 things. Majorities of Americans are, and especially younger Americans. So I think that I'm one of the things that gives me hope is the values and commitments of younger Americans. We can worry about young people on a lot of different fronts, but I think they're the ones who are going to consolidate multiracial democracy in this country. We need to empower them. We need to help them, encourage them to vote, encourage them to participate in politics. We need to give them voice. I think very, very quickly what, and this is a little bit of a punt, but what we can do, I think we need to go out and engage in politics and not just on Facebook. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of us, we're following politics, we're reading about it, we're clicking likes, and we're retweeting or re-Xing or whatever we do, but not enough Americans are actually going out and doing politics. They're not actually joining organizations and meeting face to face with people and talking to people and engaging in good old fashioned 20th century politics. And I'm pretty convinced that matters.
When you say organizations, and like, what are we talking in practical terms?
Any sorts of, there are lots of organizations out there that not like 50 or 75 years ago. But I was going to say, it doesn't, I mean, one of my issues is voting rights and registering people and getting people out to vote. I think that's an important cause. There are lots of organizations you can go work with to do that. Yeah. But there are, whether it's in environmental groups or anti-hate groups or it really doesn't matter so much the issue as long as you're not sort of pro-fascist, that going out and engaging in politics, in democratic politics, matters a lot.
Finding an organization that you think is important or an issue you care about and actually joining it, volunteering for it, engaging in it.
You said it much more articulately than I did, yes.
Listen, watching people just because people feel helpless. I know people feel helpless watching politics unfold the way it has on social media the past decade.
Yeah, but social media is nuts. I mean, we get a very distorted view of reality. In particular, we get a much more polarized sense of the world and an extremist sense of the world on social media. And that's why if you go out and actually talk to people, you realize that, well, people are actually a lot more reasonable than we thought.
Yeah, just before we got started here, I was asking Steven about what's going on at Harvard, given the war between Israel and Hamas, and I only understand what's happening through what I'm seeing on social media, which gives me a sense that it's basically its own war zone. And you tell me it's not. Yeah,
it is not. Yeah. People are much more, both sides, much more reasonable than we think.
So, Steven, last book was How Democracies Die. This one is Tyranny of the Minority. Next book, hopeful?
I'm hoping not to write a third one. The other books I write are strictly academic books. I actually study Latin America, and so I'm hoping that the next books that I write are books that you never heard of and don't care to read.
There we go. So buy this book. Next book, Steven says you don't have to buy. Thanks for the conversation. Appreciate it. Appreciate the insights. I know people got a lot out of it.